What happens when a man holding a knife to Elvis Presley's throat doesn't realize he just signed his own death warrant? Harlem, New York. It was Saturday, the 23rd of June, 1956, approximately 11:47 in the evening, when Elvis Aaron Presley stepped out of the service entrance of the Apollo Theater onto West 125th Street, wearing a navy blue jacket that cost him 2 weeks of Sun Records royalties and black leather shoes polished until they reflected the streetlights like dark mirrors. He had no idea that the next 90 seconds would transform him from the king of rock and roll into a bleeding victim on a Harlem sidewalk. The air hit him like a wall: fried fish from the corner restaurant, rotting garbage from the alley, and something else underneath it all, something electric and dangerous that he couldn't name. This was Harlem in 1956, the beating heart of Black America, the neighborhood that had birthed the music he loved more than anything, except his mother. Elvis had just spent 4 hours hiding in the back of the Apollo Theater, watching performers who didn't know he was there, studying the way they moved, the way they sang, the way they made 2,000 people forget their troubles for a few hours. If you want to find out how this incredible story ends, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss our next video. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. He clutched the guitar case to his chest with both arms, the way a father might hold a newborn child. The Martin D-28. Inside that case wasn't just an instrument. It was the last gift his mother Gladys had given him before Sun Records, before RCA Victor, before the Screaming Girls, and the television appearances and the movie contracts. She had saved for 3 years, working double shifts at the hospital in Memphis, skipping meals, wearing the same dress until it fell apart, all to buy her boy the guitar he dreamed about. The inscription carved into the wood read, "For my boy who sings like an angel. Love, Mama." That guitar was worth more to Elvis than every dollar he had ever earned or ever would earn. 3 shadows detached themselves from the wall approximately 5 meters ahead. Elvis stopped walking. His heart rate accelerated from 60 beats per minute to 120 in approximately 2 seconds. The street light above flickered twice, then steadied, illuminating 3 men in worn leather jackets. The tallest one had a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, an old wound, long-healed, the kind of scar a man earns in prison or on the streets. The shortest one kept his right hand inside his jacket pocket, fingers wrapped around something Elvis couldn't see but could easily imagine. The third one was already moving toward Elvis's right side, cutting off the only retreat path back to the theater door. Professional, coordinated, they had done this before. "Nice guitar, pretty boy." The voice belonged to the tall one with the scar, the leader. His name was Marcus Turner, though Elvis wouldn't learn that until much later. "Why don't you hand it over nice and easy, and maybe we let you walk back to wherever white boys come from when they get lost in Harlem." 3 knives appeared simultaneously, pulled from pockets and waistbands with the smooth efficiency of men who carried blades the way other men carried wallets. The steel caught the streetlight, glinting like silver fish, breaking the surface of dark water. "The guitar," Marcus repeated, taking 1 step closer. "Now, don't make this harder than it needs to be." And here is where most people, most sane, rational, self-preserving people, would have simply handed over the instrument and thanked God they escaped with their lives. A guitar could be replaced. A throat could not. The mathematics of survival were simple and obvious. But Elvis Presley, 21 years old, raised in the poverty of Tupelo, Mississippi, where he had learned to fight before he learned to sing, where he had been beaten by boys who hated his family's poverty and mocked by adults who dismissed his dreams, made a decision that would cost him dearly. He ran. 3 steps. That's all he managed. 3 desperate steps before the shortest one, a 19-year-old named Jerome Hayes, tackled him from behind with the force of a freight train. Elvis hit the concrete face first. His cheekbone cracked against the pavement. The guitar case flew from his hands, skidding across the wet sidewalk and coming to rest against a fire hydrant 10 feet away. He tasted blood, his own blood, filling his mouth from a split lip and a bitten tongue. A knee pressed into his spine. A hand grabbed his hair and yanked his head backward, exposing his throat, and then he felt it, cold steel against his skin, the edge of Marcus Turner's knife resting precisely on his carotid artery. "Stupid," Marcus said, his breath hot against Elvis's ear. "Real stupid, pretty boy. You could have walked away clean. Now you're going to bleed a little just so you remember this night." The knife moved. Not a killing stroke. Marcus Turner was many things, but he wasn't a murderer, not yet, not for a robbery. Just a thin cut, maybe 2 inches long across the side of Elvis's neck. Deep enough to bleed freely, shallow enough to heal without stitches. A message written in flesh: "You are not safe here. You are prey. You are nothing." Elvis heard footsteps retreating, heard the guitar case being lifted, heard Jerome laughing, and the third one, Willie Carter, saying something about finding a buyer downtown. Then silence, broken only by the distant wail of a saxophone from a club down the street and the sound of his own blood dripping onto the concrete. He lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Then he pushed himself up to his knees, pressed his hand against his bleeding neck, and looked down the empty street where his mother's guitar had disappeared. Gone. The inscription, the memories, the 3 years of his mother's sacrifice, all of it, gone into the Harlem night. What Elvis didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that someone had watched the entire robbery from a window on the 3rd floor of the Apollo Theater. A janitor named Samuel Washington, 62 years old, who had worked at the Apollo for 31 years and who supplemented his income by providing information to a man whose name made criminals speak in whispers. Samuel Washington picked up the telephone and dialed a number he knew by heart. 40 minutes later, the information landed on the desk of Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to everyone in Harlem as Bumpy. And when Bumpy Johnson learned what had happened on his streets, without his permission, to the most famous musician in America, the countdown to something terrible began. The next morning arrived wrapped in sunshine and the smell of coffee and the illusion of an ordinary Sunday. The apartment on 147th Street was quiet at 8:12 in the morning. Bumpy Johnson sat at his breakfast table, the New York Times open to the sports section, a plate of eggs and toast growing cold in front of him. His wife Mamie hummed in the kitchen, something by Billie Holiday, soft and sad and beautiful. Through the window, he could see children playing on the sidewalk below, their laughter rising up like music. A perfect Sunday morning in Harlem. Except for the telephone call that had come 7 minutes earlier. The butter knife lay across his plate at the wrong angle, perpendicular instead of parallel. Bumpy Johnson had placed his silverware the same way every morning for 30 years. Knife parallel to the plate edge, fork on the left, spoon on the right. He was a man of rituals, of patterns, of systems. The way he ate breakfast, the way he ran his organization, the way he maintained control over 40 square blocks of the most valuable real estate in Black America. Mamie noticed the butter knife. She noticed everything about her husband after 23 years of marriage. And when she saw that knife lying wrong, she stopped humming, looked at Bumpy's face for exactly 2 seconds, and quietly returned to the kitchen without asking questions. Some mornings were not meant for questions. The phone call had lasted 43 seconds. Bumpy had listened without interrupting, without asking who, without asking how, without asking why. Just listened, his face revealing nothing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. Someone had robbed a man on his streets, without permission, without tribute, without asking. This happened occasionally. Small-time criminals, new to the neighborhood, unaware of the rules. Usually Bumpy's lieutenants handled such matters quietly. A conversation, a warning, sometimes a broken bone or two if the offender was particularly slow to understand. The machinery of order maintained itself without requiring the king's direct attention. But then Junius had told him who the victim was. Do you know what happens when a man who has built an empire on respect realizes that empire has just been publicly humiliated? The toast grows cold. The coffee grows cold. Everything grows cold except the calculation happening behind eyes that reveal nothing. Bumpy Johnson sat motionless for nearly 3 minutes, running scenarios, weighing options, considering consequences. Elvis Presley, the white boy who sang like a black man, the kid from Memphis who had learned everything he knew from the blues musicians on Beale Street, who had taken their sound and their style and their soul and transformed it into something that was making him millions of dollars. The most famous musician in America, possibly the world, had come to Harlem to see the Apollo Theater, and 3 idiots with knives had robbed him at the stage door. Junius. Bumpy spoke the name quietly, almost gently. His chief lieutenant appeared in the doorway within 15 seconds. He had been waiting in the hallway, knowing he would be summoned, knowing that the information he had delivered required immediate action. Get everyone. The back room at Williams' barber shop. 1 hour. Junius hesitated for a fraction of a second. Everyone, Mr. Johnson. Everyone who owes me. Everyone who fears me. Everyone who has ever eaten because I allowed them to eat. Bumpy finally looked up, and Junius, who had seen this man order the elimination of rivals without blinking, felt ice form in his stomach. I want every informant on the street, every numbers runner, every shoeshine boy, every grandmother who watches from her window. Someone saw something last night. Someone knows something, and by Tuesday morning I will know everything. The machinery began to move. By 10 o'clock, 47 gambling operations across Harlem received the same message. All activities suspended until further notice. By 11, 64 informants had been contacted with the same questions. 3 men, a guitar, Saturday night, the Apollo Theater. By noon, every hustler, every prostitute, every bartender in a 40-block radius understood that Bumpy Johnson was looking for someone and that the price of useful information was $500 in cash. The price of withholding information was considerably higher. The back room of Williams's barber shop on Lenox Avenue measured approximately 15 feet by 20 feet. Red velvet curtains separated it from the main shop. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of Joe Louis and a calendar from 1954 that no one had bothered to replace. 23 men stood along those walls at 11:15 that morning, shoulder to shoulder, barely breathing. Bumpy sat in the only chair, positioned in the exact center of the room. On the small table in front of him lay a photograph cut from Life magazine. Elvis Presley, frozen in mid-performance, legs spread, guitar held like a weapon, that famous sneer on his face. The photograph was 3 months old. The man in it had been robbed on Bumpy's streets 14 hours earlier. The silence stretched for nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which 23 of the most dangerous men in Harlem stood perfectly still, waiting, not daring to speak or shift or even breathe too loudly. This was not a meeting. This was a demonstration of power. Gentlemen, Bumpy's voice was soft, almost conversational. Men leaned forward to hear. Last night, 3 individuals robbed a young white man outside the Apollo Theater. They took his guitar. They cut his throat, not deeply, but enough to leave a scar. They did this without asking permission, without paying tribute, without showing the slightest respect for whose territory they were operating in. He picked up the photograph, held it so everyone could see. The man they robbed was Elvis Presley. A ripple passed through the room, sharp intakes of breath, widened eyes, the shuffle of feet. Everyone knew that name. Everyone had heard those songs. Everyone understood, in that instant, the magnitude of what had happened. When this story reaches the newspapers, and it will reach the newspapers, gentlemen, because stories always reach the newspapers, every reporter in America will write about how dangerous Harlem is. Every booking agent will warn their artists away from the Apollo. Every white musician who might have come here to learn, to listen, to pay respect to the source of their art will stay home instead. Bumpy stood slowly, and 23 men straightened their spines as if pulled by invisible strings. 20 years. I have spent 20 years making Harlem safe for our people, safe for our businesses, safe for our artists, and 3 fools with knives have just endangered everything. His voice dropped even lower, and somehow that made it more terrifying. I want names. I want addresses. I want that guitar on this table by Tuesday morning. 48 hours. Anyone who brings me useful information will receive $500 and my gratitude. Anyone who knows something and stays silent. He didn't finish the sentence. The silence finished it for him. The meeting ended at 11:22. Within an hour, the entire neighborhood was searching. Within 3 hours, the first whispers began to circulate about what would happen to the men who had made this mistake. And at approximately 3:15 that afternoon, a shoeshine boy named Theodore Williams, 12 years old, sharp-eyed, positioned on the corner of 123rd Street since dawn, approached one of Bumpy's lieutenants with information that would blow the case wide open. He had seen 3 men getting into a dark sedan the night before, around midnight. One of them carried a guitar case, which seemed strange at that hour. Theodore hadn't thought much of it at the time, but he had noticed the license plate, or part of it. 4 numbers out of 6. 4 numbers was enough. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, 4 numbers was more than enough to find anyone. The vehicle registration office opened at 9 o'clock Monday morning. By 9:45, Bumpy's people had a name and address connected to those 4 numbers. By 10:30, they had confirmed that the car belonged to an associate of a small-time criminal named Marcus Turner, who was known to operate out of an apartment on 144th Street. The net was closing, and Marcus Turner, sitting in that apartment with his 2 accomplices, counting the money from Saturday night and admiring the guitar he planned to sell to a collector downtown, had no idea that he had approximately 18 hours left as a free man. 36 hours remained on the clock. 1 would be found by midnight, the 2nd would be found by dawn, and the 3rd, the one who had held the knife, the one who had cut Elvis Presley's throat, would be found by Bumpy Johnson himself. What happened after that would become a legend whispered on the streets of Harlem for the next 50 years. The basement of Chang's Laundry on 131st Street had witnessed many things over the years that would never appear in any police report. Prohibition-era whiskey storage, gambling operations that ran 24 hours a day, conversations that ended careers and sometimes ended lives. The concrete walls had absorbed secrets for 3 decades, and they would absorb more tonight. It was Sunday, 11:40 in the evening. 33 hours remained on Bumpy Johnson's deadline. Willie Carter sat tied to a wooden chair in the center of that basement, and he understood with absolute clarity that his life as he knew it was over. The question now was whether his life in any form would continue past the next hour. He was 24 years old, a small-time pickpocket who had graduated to armed robbery 6 months earlier because the money was better and he was tired of being poor. He had grown up on 128th Street, dropped out of school at 15, served 18 months at Rikers for assault when he was 19. His mother still lived in the same apartment where he had been born, still went to church every Sunday, still believed her youngest son would turn his life around someday. Willie had thought he was smart. He had thought hiding at his third cousin's apartment in the Bronx would be enough. Who would think to look there? Who would connect him to a robbery that had happened in Manhattan, across the river, in a different world? He had been wrong, spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The men who came to his cousin's door had smiled politely. They had asked if Willie was home. His cousin, confused and frightened by something she couldn't name, had said yes. And then everything happened very fast. Hands grabbing him, a cloth over his face that smelled like chemicals, and then darkness. Now he sat in this basement, wrists burning from the rope, bladder threatening to release, staring at 4 silhouettes that stood just beyond the reach of the single bare light bulb swinging overhead. Water dripped somewhere behind him, a slow, steady rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down the minutes of his life. One of the silhouettes stepped forward, and Willie's heart nearly stopped. He recognized the shape, the height, the way the man moved, like a predator conserving energy because it knew the prey had nowhere to run. Junius Freeman, Bumpy Johnson's right hand, the man who handled problems that required permanent solutions. Willie. The voice was almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask questions. You're going to answer them. The speed and honesty of your answers will determine what happens next. Willie nodded so frantically that his neck hurt. Words tumbled out before he could stop them. I'll tell you everything, I swear, whatever you want to know. Please, I didn't know who he was. We didn't know. Marcus just said he looked like money, that's all. We didn't know he was anyone important. Willie! Junius held up one hand, and Willie's mouth snapped shut like a trap. I haven't asked my questions yet. Save your words. You're going to need them. The silence that followed lasted approximately 15 seconds. 15 seconds during which Willie Carter aged 10 years. First question. Who planned the robbery? Marcus Turner. The name exploded from Willie's mouth. He's the one. He picked the target. He said the white boy looked rich, said nobody would miss him, said we'd be in and out in 30 seconds. I just went along. I swear to God, I just went along. Junius nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Second question, where is the guitar now? Marcus has it. He kept it. Said he knew a collector downtown who'd pay $500 for it, maybe more. Said it was some kind of special guitar, worth a lot of money. Third question. Junius moved closer, and Willie could finally see his eyes in the dim light. They were calm, patient, empty of anything resembling mercy. Where is Marcus Turner right now? And this was the moment, the fulcrum point, the instant where Willie Carter made the decision that would save his life but destroy everything else, his friendships, his reputation, his ability to ever walk the streets of Harlem again without looking over his shoulder. 144th Street, Building 17, Apartment 3A. He's there with Jerome. They're planning to leave town tomorrow morning. They heard you were looking, and they're scared. They're real scared, Mr. Freeman. They should be. Junius stepped back into the shadows. One final question, Willie, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer, because your entire future depends on your honesty. Did you know who you were robbing? Did you know that man was Elvis Presley? Willie shook his head so hard that tears flew from his eyes. No, I swear on my mother's life. I didn't know until this morning when I heard people talking. Marcus didn't tell us. He just said it was some white boy from downtown. If I'd known, I never would have. I'm not stupid. I wouldn't have. He trailed off, realizing the absurdity of claiming intelligence while sitting tied to a chair in a basement, having been caught within 14 hours of committing a crime. The silence stretched. Water dripped. The light bulb swung gently, making shadows dance across the walls like ghosts. Then Junius spoke. You're going to leave New York tonight. There's a bus station on 42nd Street. You're going to buy a ticket to somewhere far away, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Atlanta, I don't care where. You're never going to come back to this city. You're never going to speak of this night to anyone. And if I ever hear your name mentioned in connection with any criminal activity north of 110th Street, I will find you. What happens tonight will seem like a pleasant memory compared to what I will do then. Relief flooded through Willie's body with such intensity that he sobbed, actually sobbed, like a child who had been told the monster under the bed wasn't real. "Thank you," he gasped. "Thank you, Mr. Freeman. I'll go tonight. I'll never come back. I swear on everything. There's one more thing." Junius's voice stopped the relief cold. "A reminder, something to help you remember this conversation in the years to come." Two men emerged from the shadows. One of them held Willie's left hand steady against the armrest of the chair, spreading the fingers flat against the wood. The other produced a small hammer. "One finger for one crime," Junius said calmly. "That's the price in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem. You participated in a robbery. You helped cut a man's throat. This is mercy, Willie. This is you walking away with your life and most of your body intact. Remember that." The hammer came down on Willie's pinky finger with a sound like a branch snapping. The scream that tore from Willie's throat echoed off the concrete walls and disappeared into the Harlem night. He screamed until his voice gave out, until he could taste blood in his throat, until the world narrowed to nothing but the white-hot agony radiating from his hand. 20 minutes later, Willie Carter stood at the Greyhound station on 42nd Street, his broken finger wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, his face wet with tears he couldn't stop. He bought a one-way ticket to Atlanta. He would never return to New York. He would never see his mother again except for one visit, years later when she was dying. And for the rest of his life, whenever it rained, he would feel a phantom pain in his left hand where the pinky finger had never healed quite right. One down, two to go. And at that exact moment in the apartment on 144th Street, Marcus Turner was showing Jerome Hayes the guitar they had stolen, explaining his plan to sell it to a collector who specialized in rare instruments. Neither of them knew that Willie had been taken. Neither of them knew that their hiding place had just been compromised. The clock read 31 hours remaining. The subway platform at 145th Street smelled of urine, machine oil, and desperation. Jerome Hayes stood in the shadows near the far end of the platform, clutching a one-way ticket to the Bronx like a talisman against evil. It was Monday, the 25th of June, 2:17 in the morning. 24 hours remained on Bumpy Johnson's deadline. Jerome was 19 years old, the youngest of the three, the most scared, the one who had tackled Elvis from behind while Marcus held the knife. He hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. He had just wanted money, enough money to help his mother pay the rent, enough to buy his little sister the dress she wanted for her 8th grade graduation. When Marcus had proposed the robbery, it had seemed simple, easy, victimless almost. White boy from downtown, obviously rich, Probably wouldn't even report it. Now Jerome understood how wrong he had been. About everything. He had learned about Willie 3 hours ago. A whispered conversation overheard at a bar on Lenox Avenue. Willie had been taken. Willie had talked. Men were looking for Marcus and Jerome, men who worked for someone whose name made grown criminals speak in whispers. Jerome had left the apartment on 144th Street through the fire escape, leaving Marcus behind with the guitar and the money and the delusion that everything would be fine. Marcus had always been the confident one, the leader, the one who made plans. But Marcus's confidence meant nothing against Bumpy Johnson. The train arrived with a screech of metal that made Jerome flinch. He stepped into the last car, chose a seat in the corner where he could see both doors, and allowed himself one small breath of relief as the doors slid closed. Safe. He was moving. Every second took him farther from Harlem, farther from danger, closer to his aunt's apartment in the Bronx, where no one would think to look for him. The man in the gray overcoat had boarded the same car, 3 doors down. Jerome noticed him immediately, noticed the way he sat too still, the way his eyes never left Jerome's face, the way his right hand rested casually inside his coat pocket. For 2 stops, neither man moved. The train swayed and rattled through the darkness beneath Manhattan. A drunk man slept in the seat across from Jerome, oblivious. A woman with a shopping bag stared at her reflection in the window. At the 161st Street station, Jerome bolted. He was through the doors before they fully opened, his feet hitting the platform at a dead sprint. Up the stairs, 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. Through the turnstile without paying, no time, and out onto the street. The night air hit his face like a slap. Jerome ran left, then right, then left again, through streets he didn't recognize, past buildings he had never seen. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. Behind him, footsteps, silence. He couldn't tell anymore. He turned a corner and stopped dead. 3 men stood 10 meters ahead, blocking the street. They weren't running. They weren't shouting. They just stood there, hands in pockets, watching him with the patient stillness of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to go. Behind him, footsteps approached, not running, walking, the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Jerome Hayes! The voice came from behind him, calm, almost conversational. Bumpy Johnson would like a word. Jerome's knees buckled. He didn't fall, but it was close. The name hit him like a physical blow. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, the man who controlled everything from 110th Street to 155th, the man whose enemies had a tendency to simply disappear. I didn't know. The words came out as a whisper. We didn't know who he was. Please, I have a mother. I have a little sister. Please. The man in the gray overcoat had reached him now. He put a hand on Jerome's shoulder, not roughly, almost gently, and leaned close. Your mother lives on 129th Street, apartment 2B. She goes to church every Sunday at First Baptist. Your sister is graduating from 8th grade next month. Beautiful family, Jerome. It would be a shame if something happened to them because of your choices. The threat wasn't even veiled. It hung in the air like poison gas. What do you want? Jerome's voice cracked. I'll tell you anything. I'll do anything. We know. That's why we're going to take a little trip back to your mother's apartment. And you're going to tell her everything. Who you robbed, what you did, where Marcus Turner is hiding. She's going to hear every word. And when you're done confessing to your mother the kind of man her son has become, you're going to give us the information we need. They walked Jerome back to Harlem. Not roughly, not violently. They didn't need to. The threat against his family was enough to make him docile as a lamb. The apartment on 129th Street was small and clean and full of love, religious pictures on the walls, a crocheted blanket on the couch, the smell of collard greens still lingering from dinner. Jerome's mother, Clara, opened the door in her bathrobe, her face shifting from confusion to fear to something worse when she saw the men standing behind her son. "Baby, what's happening? Who are these men?" Jerome sat at his mother's kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood, and confessed everything: the robbery, the guitar, the knife, Elvis Presley, Marcus Turner's hiding place, every shameful detail, spoken aloud while his mother wept in the chair across from him. When he finished, Clara Hayes stood up. She walked around the table, and she slapped her son so hard that he tasted blood. "You brought shame on this family," she said, her voice trembling with fury and grief. "You brought shame on everything I taught you, everything your father died believing you would become. Whatever happens to you now, you deserve it. Get out of my house." Jerome left with the men. He gave them the new address. Marcus had moved that afternoon, fleeing to an abandoned building on the edge of Washington Heights. Jerome told them everything he knew: the location, the layout, the fact that Marcus had a knife and wasn't afraid to use it. They let Jerome go at dawn with a warning that echoed Willie's: "Leave New York, never come back, forget this ever happened." Jerome took a bus to Baltimore that afternoon. He never saw his mother again. She refused his letters. She refused his phone calls. She died in 1972 without ever speaking to her son after that night. 2 down, 1 to go. And Marcus Turner, the leader, the one who had held the knife to Elvis Presley's throat, sat alone in an abandoned building with a stolen guitar and a knife, believing he was safe, believing he was smart, believing he could outrun the consequences of his actions. He had 18 hours to live as a whole man. After that, he would spend the rest of his life missing something he would never get back. The abandoned building on 162nd Street and Edgecombe Avenue had been a boarding house for railroad workers 30 years ago. Now it was a skeleton: broken windows, rotting floors, walls covered with water stains and graffiti. Rats outnumbered humans. The smell of decay permeated everything. Marcus Turner had been hiding here for 6 hours. It was Monday, 4:40 in the afternoon. 8 hours remained on Bumpy Johnson's deadline. Marcus sat in a dark room on the 2nd floor, his back against a crumbling wall, the stolen guitar propped beside him, a knife clutched in his right hand. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, hadn't eaten in 24, hadn't done anything except sit in the darkness and listen for footsteps. Willie was gone. Jerome had disappeared. The apartment on 144th was compromised. Marcus had fled when a neighbor mentioned that men had been asking questions. He had grabbed the guitar and run, because the guitar was worth money, because the guitar was his ticket out of New York, because some part of him still believed he could escape. The footsteps started at 4:53. Not loud, not fast, just a steady rhythm of leather soles on wooden stairs, ascending toward the 2nd floor with the patient confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marcus gripped the knife tighter. His palm was slick with sweat. In the dim light filtering through a broken window, he could see the door to his room, warped, hanging slightly off its hinges, offering no real protection. The footsteps stopped outside. 3 seconds of silence, then a knock, polite, almost gentle. Marcus Turner. The voice was calm, cultured, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. "I know you're in there. I know you have a knife. I'm going to open this door now, and I'm going to walk in, and you're going to put that knife down. Not because I'm asking you to, because you're a smart man, and smart men know when they've lost. The door opened. Marcus had expected enforcers, thugs, large men with weapons and violent intentions. What he saw instead was a man of medium height, perhaps 55 years old, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He carried a walking cane with a silver handle shaped like a lion's head. He walked into the room as if he owned it, as if he owned the building, the street, the entire borough. Bumpy Johnson had come in person. Marcus understood immediately what this meant. When Bumpy sent his men, there was room for negotiation. When Bumpy came himself, you had become something more than a criminal to be punished. You had become a lesson to be taught. The guitar. Bumpy pointed with his cane toward the Martin D-28 leaning against the wall. "I'll take that now." Marcus couldn't move. Every muscle in his body had locked up, frozen by a terror more complete than anything he had ever experienced. He watched as Bumpy walked calmly to the guitar, picked it up, examined it in the dim light. Beautiful instrument, Martin D-28, 1945 if I'm not mistaken, worth maybe $500 to a collector. He turned the guitar over, examining the back. Worth considerably more to the young man you stole it from. His mother saved for 3 years to buy him this guitar. Did you know that, Marcus? Marcus found his voice. It emerged as a croak. "I didn't know. I swear, Mr. Johnson. I didn't know who he was. He just looked like money. We didn't know it was Elvis Presley." "Yes, you did." Bumpy's voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it somehow more terrifying. "Maybe not when you planned the robbery, but you knew by the time you held your knife to his throat. You saw his face, you heard him beg, and you cut him anyway. You marked him. You left a scar that he'll carry for the rest of his life." He set the guitar carefully against the wall, out of harm's way. Then he turned back to Marcus, and his eyes were the coldest things Marcus had ever seen. "Put down the knife, Marcus." Marcus didn't put down the knife. Instead, in a moment of desperate courage or absolute stupidity, the line between them razor thin, he lunged. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Marcus drove the knife toward Bumpy's chest. Bumpy shifted his weight slightly, moved his cane in a short arc, and Marcus found himself on the floor with his right arm twisted behind his back at an angle that sent lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder. The knife clattered away into darkness. Bumpy hadn't even raised his voice. "That was stupid, Marcus. Although I suppose I should thank you. You've made what happens next much easier for me to justify." 2 men entered the room. They had been waiting in the hallway. They hauled Marcus to his feet, held him upright when his legs refused to support him. Bumpy picked up the knife Marcus had dropped, examined it in the fading light, tested the edge with his thumb. "This is the knife you used to cut Elvis Presley's throat, isn't it?" Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. "You held this blade against a young man's neck and drew blood. You did it for money. You did it for power. You did it because you could." Bumpy paused, turning the knife slowly. "And now you're going to learn what happens when you exercise power without permission on my streets." Marcus began to beg. The words poured out of him, promises, pleas, offers of money he didn't have, oaths of loyalty he couldn't keep. He begged for mercy. He begged for a second chance. He begged for his life. Bumpy listened patiently until the words ran out. "You're not going to die tonight, Marcus. That would be too easy, too quick. You're going to live with what I'm about to do. You're going to remember this night every single day for the rest of your life, and everyone who sees you will know this is what happens when you disrespect Bumpy Johnson's Harlem." What happened next took approximately 40 minutes. It happened in that dark room in that abandoned building with two men holding Marcus steady while Bumpy Johnson administered a lesson that would be whispered about on the streets of Harlem for the next 50 years. The finger was removed cleanly. The index finger of Marcus's right hand, the same hand that had held the knife to Elvis's throat. Bumpy used Marcus's own blade for the work. Marcus screamed until his voice gave out, and then he just shook, making sounds that weren't quite human. When it was over, Bumpy carefully placed the severed finger in a small glass jar filled with formaldehyde that one of his men had brought. He held the jar up to the dim light, examining his handiwork. "This finger is going to have one more job before it's retired," he said calmly. "It's going to deliver a message, not to you, Marcus, to someone else, someone who needs to understand that Harlem takes care of its guests." Marcus was deposited on a street corner in the Bronx 3 hours later, his hand wrapped in bloody bandages, his mind shattered by pain and terror. He would never return to Harlem. He would never speak of that night. He would work as a janitor in Baltimore for the next 43 years, always wearing gloves, always hiding his right hand, always flinching when anyone mentioned music or guitars or the name Elvis Presley. 3 down, 3 punished, 0 remaining. The guitar was safe. The lesson was taught. And Bumpy Johnson walked out of that abandoned building with a human finger in a glass jar, ready to deliver a message that would transform a robbery into a legend. The deadline had been 48 hours. He had finished in 39. The Hotel Teresa on 125th Street rose 13 stories above the Harlem streets, like a monument to black excellence in a world that offered precious little of it. They called it the Waldorf of Harlem, the only hotel in the neighborhood where black travelers could rent a room without being humiliated, the only hotel where celebrities, from Duke Ellington to Joe Louis, had laid their heads without fear. Its red brick facade had witnessed history, had sheltered greatness, had served as a beacon of dignity in an undignified age. On this particular morning, it also housed the most famous white musician in America, hiding from the press and nursing a wound that would leave a permanent scar. It was Tuesday, the 26th of June, 1956, 10:14 in the morning. The deadline had passed 6 hours ago. Bumpy Johnson's work was complete, and Elvis Presley sat on the edge of his hotel bed in room 712, staring at the bandage on his neck in the mirror across the room, listening to his manager Tom Parker rage about lawsuits and publicity and the urgent need to flee New York immediately. "This is madness." Parker's face had turned the color of raw beef. His Dutch accent thickened with every word, the way it always did when he was angry or frightened or both. "You were attacked. You were robbed. You were cut like a piece of meat. And you want to stay here, in this neighborhood?" Elvis didn't answer. He was thinking about the guitar, his mother's guitar, the Martin D-28 that had been with him since he was 11 years old, that had accompanied him from poverty to fame, that still bore the inscription she had carved with her own hands, "For my boy, who sings like an angel. Love, Mama." 3 days without that guitar had felt like 3 days without oxygen. "Are you listening to me?" Parker planted himself directly in front of Elvis, blocking the mirror. "The police have been useless, completely useless. They took a report. They asked a few questions. They did nothing. We need to cut our losses and leave. Today. Now. Before this story gets any bigger." A knock at the door silenced Parker mid-rant. Elvis stood, crossed the room, and opened the door to find a boy standing in the hallway, perhaps 14 years old. Clean white shirt, pressed dark trousers, shoes polished to a military shine. He held 2 boxes in his arms, one long and narrow, unmistakably shaped like a guitar case, and one small, about the size of a jewelry box. Delivery for Mr. Presley." The boy's voice was formal, rehearsed. From Mr. EBJ, I was told to wait for a response. Elvis stared at the boxes. His heart had begun to pound against his ribs with an intensity that made him dizzy. He knew that shape. He knew that case. He had carried it 1,000 times, had held it against his body on stages across America, had slept with it beside his bed like a talisman against the darkness. "Who sent you?" Parker demanded, pushing past Elvis. "Who is EBJ? What's in those boxes?" The boy didn't flinch. "I was told to deliver these to Mr. Presley personally. That's all I know, sir." Elvis took the boxes from the boy's hands. The weight of the larger one told him everything he needed to know before he even lifted the lid. He carried both boxes to the bed, set them down gently, and unlatched the guitar case. The Martin D-28 lay inside, nestled in velvet that someone had added. The original case had no such lining. Elvis lifted the guitar slowly, almost reverently, and examined every inch. Not a scratch, not a mark, not a single broken string. The inscription on the back was still visible, the letters worn slightly from years of being pressed against his body while he performed. He held the guitar against his chest and closed his eyes. For a long moment he didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there in the hotel room, reunited with a piece of his own soul that he had thought was lost forever. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the smaller box. "Don't." Parker's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Elvis, whatever is in there, don't open it. Just leave it. We'll call the police. Elvis opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of white cotton, sat a small glass jar. The jar was filled with clear liquid, formaldehyde, though Elvis didn't know that word, and floating in that liquid, preserved like a medical specimen, was a human finger. The room went absolutely silent. Parker made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a scream, something strangled and primal. Elvis simply stared at the finger floating in its jar. He could see details, an uneven fingernail, calluses on the pad, a small scar near the first knuckle. Someone's finger, someone's life, permanently altered. A note was tucked beneath the jar. Elvis unfolded it with hands that trembled only slightly. "Mr. Presley, I was informed of the unpleasantness that occurred on my streets Saturday evening. Please accept my sincere apologies and the return of your property. Those responsible have been located and disciplined. The enclosed item belonged to the man who held the knife to your throat. He will never hold a knife again. You are welcome in Harlem any time. With respect, EBJ." Elvis read the note twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. "We need to call the police." Parker's voice cracked on the last word. "This is evidence. This is assault. This is barbaric. This is justice." Elvis's voice was quiet, but something in it made Parker take a step backward. "This man, EBJ, found my guitar when the police couldn't. Punished the people who attacked me when the police wouldn't. Did it in 3 days while the authorities did nothing. He cut off someone's finger. The man who cut my throat." Elvis touched the bandage on his neck. "The man who held a knife to my jugular while his friends laughed. The man who left me bleeding on a sidewalk like garbage." He paused, looking at the jar again. "You see a finger. I see consequences. I see someone who made sure this will never happen again." Parker stared at his client, the 21-year-old boy from Tupelo who had become the biggest star in America, the meal ticket that had made Parker wealthy beyond his dreams, and realized he was looking at a stranger. Something had changed in Elvis's eyes. Something hard had formed where innocence used to live. "You can't possibly be defending this." "I'm not defending it."
Elvis carefully closed the lid on the small box. "I'm understanding it. There's a difference." He walked to the window and looked out at the Harlem streets below. Somewhere out there, a man named EBJ, whom Elvis now understood to be Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a name he had heard whispered in certain circles, had moved heaven and earth to return a stolen guitar, had hunted down 3 men in 48 hours, had sent a message written in flesh and bone. "I want to meet him." Parker's face went from red to white in approximately 2 seconds. "Absolutely not. Out of the question. I forbid it. Do you understand what you're saying? This man is a criminal, a gangster, a man who did what you couldn't do." Elvis turned from the window. "What the police couldn't do."
What nobody could do except him. He picked up the guitar, strummed a soft chord, and something like peace settled over his features. He returned my mother's guitar. The least I can do is thank him in person. He walked to the door where the delivery boy still waited and pressed a $50 bill into his hand. "Tell Mr. Johnson that I would be honored to accept any invitation he cares to extend. I'll be at this hotel until Friday. Any time, any place. I'll come alone." The boy nodded once and vanished down the hallway. Parker collapsed into a chair, his face the color of old newspaper. "You're going to get yourself killed. You understand that? You're going to walk into some gangster's den, and you're going to get yourself killed, and I'm going to have to explain to your mother why her son is dead." Elvis picked up his guitar, settled it against his body, and began to play, softly, almost absently, the opening bars of "That's All Right, Mama," the song that had started everything. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll die knowing her guitar is safe." The invitation arrived 6 hours later. Wells's Supper Club on 7th Avenue occupied a modest storefront between a barber shop and a pharmacy, easily overlooked by anyone who didn't know what happened behind its doors. The front room served excellent fried chicken and waffles to a rotating cast of musicians, politicians, and neighborhood regulars. The back room, the room that didn't appear on any floor plan, that wasn't mentioned in any city records, served an entirely different purpose. It was Wednesday, the 27th of June, 12 minutes past midnight. The front room had been closed for 3 hours. The staff had been sent home. Only the back room remained active, its occupant waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that most of life consisted of waiting. Bumpy Johnson sat at a round table covered with white linen, a glass of Kentucky bourbon at his elbow, a plate of untouched fried chicken before him. He wore his usual uniform, charcoal suit, white shirt, blood-red tie, but tonight he had added a small touch, a gardenia in his lapel, white and fragrant, his favorite flower. 4 armed men stood guard outside the velvet curtain separating the back room from the rest of the restaurant. They had been given explicit instructions. When the white man arrives, let him through. Don't search him, don't question him, just let him through. At 12:17, the curtain parted, and Elvis Presley stepped into the room. He came alone, exactly as he had promised. No manager, no bodyguard, no entourage of handlers and hangers-on. Just Elvis, 21 years old, wearing a simple black jacket over a white shirt, his hair pomaded but not sculpted, his face showing every one of the sleepless nights since Saturday. He carried the Martin D-28 on his back. For 3 seconds that seemed to stretch into infinity. Neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other, the king of Harlem and the king of rock and roll, 2 men from different worlds who had been brought together by violence and were about to discover what else they might have in common. Bumpy rose from his chair. He moved around the table and extended his hand. "Mr. Presley, welcome to my restaurant. Please, sit, eat." Elvis shook the hand, firm grip, steady eye contact. Bumpy noticed. Bumpy noticed everything. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for seeing me." Elvis took the offered seat across from Bumpy. "And thank you for returning my guitar. I can't tell you what it means to me, what she means to me." She, Bumpy resumed his own seat and gestured for Elvis to help himself to the chicken. "The guitar. My mother saved for 3 years to buy it for me. Worked double shifts, skipped meals, wore the same dress until it fell apart." Elvis touched the case beside him almost unconsciously. "It's not just an instrument, it's her. It's everything she sacrificed so I could have something beautiful." Bumpy nodded slowly. "I read the inscription. 'For my boy who sings like an angel.' That's a mother's love written in wood and steel." "Yes, sir, it is." For a moment, both men were silent. The noise of the city filtered through the walls, distant traffic, a saxophone playing somewhere down the street, the eternal pulse of Harlem after midnight. Then Bumpy spoke. "You came to my neighborhood Saturday night, to the Apollo Theater. Why?" Elvis didn't hesitate. "Because that's where the music comes from. Everything I know, every lick, every growl, every move, I learned from black musicians on Beale Street in Memphis. Arthur Crudup, Howlin' Wolf, Big Bill Brunzie. They taught me. They shared something precious with me. And I wanted to see where it all started. I wanted to stand in the Apollo and feel the history, pay my respects." "Most white musicians who take our sound," Bumpy said carefully, "never acknowledge where it came from. They pretend they invented it. They grow rich while the men who taught them die poor." "I know." Elvis's voice was quiet. "And I hate it. I tell everyone, every interviewer, every reporter, that I learned from black artists. That rock and roll didn't come from me, it came from them. Most of the time, they edit it out. They don't want to hear it." Bumpy studied the young man across from him, looking for deception, looking for performance, finding unexpectedly something that appeared to be genuine. "You came to Harlem alone, without security, to pay homage to black artists. That takes courage. Or stupidity." A ghost of a smile crossed Elvis's face. "I've been told they're hard to tell apart sometimes." "They are, but in this case I'm inclined toward courage." Bumpy took a sip of his bourbon. "And now I'm told you came here tonight to meet me, alone as well, despite knowing what I am, what I do, because of what you did." Elvis met Bumpy's eyes directly. "The police took a report and forgot about me. My manager wanted to run away and forget it happened. You found the men who attacked me in 2 days. You recovered my mother's guitar. You—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You made sure they understood there are consequences. The finger." "The finger." Elvis nodded. "Tom, my manager, thinks I should be horrified, disgusted, terrified. And are you?" The question hung in the air. Elvis considered it seriously, the way he considered everything related to the guitar and the men who had taken it. "I've been poor, Mr. Johnson, real poor. The kind of poor where you eat mayonnaise sandwiches for dinner because there's nothing else. The kind of poor where your daddy goes to prison and your mama works herself half to death just to keep a roof over your head. And when you're that poor, you learn something about justice." He leaned forward slightly. "Justice doesn't come from courtrooms, not for people like us, like I used to be before all this. Justice comes from people who are willing to do what needs to be done. People who say, this is wrong, and then make it right, even if making it right means getting your hands dirty." Bumpy was silent for a long moment. Then he began to laugh, a genuine laugh, full of surprise and something that might have been respect. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Presley." "Neither are you, Mr. Johnson." "What did you expect?" Elvis thought about it. "A thug, a brute, someone who hurt people because he liked hurting people. He shook his head. But that's not who I'm looking at. I'm looking at a man who runs a neighborhood, who protects his people, who makes sure there are rules and consequences for breaking them. I'm a criminal. Bumpy's voice was flat. By every legal definition, I'm a criminal. I run gambling operations. I control policy banks. I've done things that would put me in prison for the rest of my life if the authorities ever developed the competence to prove them. Yes, sir, but you're also the man who made sure no one will ever rob a musician on these streets again. That finger in the jar, it wasn't just punishment. It was a promise, a guarantee. Elvis paused. I've performed in places where promoters cheated me, where club owners tried to steal my equipment, where crowds got violent because they hated what I represented. Nobody ever protected me. Nobody ever said, touch this artist and there will be consequences, until you. The conversation continued for another 2 hours. They talked about music, the blues that Bumpy had loved since his childhood in South Carolina, the way Elvis had fallen in love with gospel singing at the Pentecostal church in Tupelo. They talked about family, Bumpy's wife Mamie, his daughter Ruthie, the way fatherhood had changed how he saw the world. They talked about race, the strange position Elvis occupied as a white man singing black music, the even stranger position Bumpy occupied as a black man wielding real power in a city that refused to acknowledge it. At one point, Elvis took out his guitar and played, not Heartbreak Hotel or Blue Suede Shoes or any of the hits that were making him millions. He played Arthur Crudup's That's All Right, the song that had started everything, playing it slow and reverent, like a hymn. Bumpy listened with closed eyes. When Elvis finished, he opened them and nodded once. You learned well. I learned from the best. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Elvis finally rose to leave. At the velvet curtain, he turned back. Mr. Johnson, I know I can't repay what you did for me, but if there's ever anything at all, that I can do for you, you only have to ask. Bumpy considered this for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small, something that glittered in the low light. It was a tie pin, gold, shaped like a lion's head, matching the handle of his cane. Take this. He pressed it into Elvis's hand. If you ever need help, real help, the kind that money can't buy and lawyers can't provide, show this to any black man in any city in America. Tell him Bumpy Johnson sent you. Someone will find a way to reach me. Elvis looked at the pin in his hand. Such a small thing, such an enormous gift. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. Just remember, artists are protected. On my streets, in my city, under my watch, artists don't get touched. Not anymore. Not ever again. Go make your music, Mr. Presley, and tell people where it came from. Elvis walked out into the Harlem night at 3:17 in the morning, his mother's guitar on his back, a gangster's tie pin in his pocket, and a story he would carry for the rest of his life. The king of rock and roll and the king of Harlem would never meet again. But the connection forged that night would echo through both their worlds for decades to come. And in that back room at Wells's Supper Club, Bumpy Johnson sat alone for a while longer, finishing his bourbon, thinking about the strange turns life could take. A robbery had led to a meeting. A meeting had led to an alliance. An alliance would lead to a legend. He raised his glass to the empty room. To consequences, he said softly, may they always find the right people. Stories travel faster than bullets in the underworld. They move through back rooms and prison cells, through whispered conversations in jazz clubs and shouted warnings on street corners. They grow with each telling, accumulating details both true and imagined, until the line between history and legend becomes impossible to trace. The story of Elvis Presley and the severed finger was no exception. It started in Harlem, naturally, within a week of that midnight meeting at Wells's Supper Club. Every numbers runner, every policy banker, every hustler from 110th Street to 155th knew some version of the tale. 3 fools robbed a white musician. Bumpy Johnson found them in 48 hours. One of them lost a finger. The finger was delivered to the victim in a jar. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. Some versions claimed all 3 robbers had lost fingers. Others insisted they had lost more than fingers. One particularly creative version had Bumpy cutting off the finger himself with a butter knife while reciting poetry. But the core remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson protected artists. Touch a musician in Harlem, lose a part of yourself. By July, the story had reached Philadelphia. By August, it was circulating in Chicago's South Side. By September, musicians in New Orleans were discussing it over drinks at the Dewdrop Inn, their voices low, their eyes wide with something between horror and admiration. "You hear about that thing in Harlem?" Sam Cooke asked Little Richard one night in Los Angeles, backstage at the El Monte Legion Stadium. "About Elvis and that finger?" Little Richard nodded slowly. His flamboyant stage persona had vanished, replaced by the shrewd businessman who had survived in an industry designed to chew up black artists and spit them out. "I heard. Question is, do you believe it? I believe Bumpy Johnson is real. I believe Elvis's guitar was stolen. I believe those 3 guys who robbed him disappeared." Sam paused. "Everything else is details." "Details matter, honey." Little Richard leaned closer. "The detail that matters is this. If I go to Harlem, if I play the Apollo, I'm protected. Not by police. We know what police protection is worth. Protected by someone who actually has the power to protect. That's what you take from a story about a man getting his finger cut off? That's what I take from a story about consequences, about rules, about somebody finally saying artists are sacred and meaning it enough to enforce it." Little Richard smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We've been vulnerable our whole careers. Promoters cheat us, club owners rob us, audiences attack us, and nobody does anything. Now there's someone who does something. That's worth talking about." The story spread, and with it spread an understanding, unwritten, unspoken, but absolutely real, that Harlem had become a sanctuary. Over the next 12 months, a parade of black musicians made their way to New York with a confidence that hadn't existed before. Jackie Wilson performed at the Apollo in October of '56, walking the streets of Harlem without fear for the first time in his career. Ruth Brown came up from Atlantic City for a 2-week engagement, telling friends she felt safer in Harlem than in her own neighborhood. James Brown, still years away from becoming the godfather of soul, played a small club on Lenox Avenue and was astonished when local men approached him not to threaten or extort, but to offer protection. "Bumpy says artists don't get touched," one of them explained. "That means you don't get touched. Understand?" James Brown understood. Everyone understood. The rules had changed. And it wasn't just black musicians. Word spread through the white music world as well. Carefully, quietly, but persistently. Elvis never spoke publicly about his Harlem experience, but he talked privately, in dressing rooms and recording studios, to musicians who needed to know. "There's a man in Harlem," he would say, his voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Bumpy Johnson. If you go there, if you perform at the Apollo or any of those clubs, you're protected. He made that clear. He made that very, very clear." And then Elvis would pause, and something would flicker in his eyes. a memory of a glass jar and its contents, before he continued, "Don't test it, though. Whatever you do, don't test it. The man who held a knife to my throat tested it. That man's still alive. But he'll never play guitar again, never hold a knife again, never do much of anything that requires 10 fingers." The message was received. The rules were followed. And for the next 12 years, until Bumpy Johnson took his final breath, Harlem remained one of the safest neighborhoods in America, not for everyone, but for artists, for musicians, for the people who created the culture that made the neighborhood famous. This was the real legacy of that June night in 1956, not the violence, not the finger, the system it created, the understanding it established, the protection it guaranteed. In a world where black artists had always been vulnerable, where their talent was exploited and their safety ignored, one man had drawn a line. One man had said, "Not here, not in my neighborhood, not on my watch," and one man had enforced that line with a ruthlessness that made it absolute. Bumpy Johnson never talked about the Elvis incident publicly. It wasn't his way. He operated in shadows, in whispers, in the spaces between official stories. But those who knew him, those who worked with him, those who owed their safety to his protection, they knew what he had done, and they honored it the way you honor a debt that can never be repaid. Artists are protected. Artists don't get touched. Artists are sacred. 3 simple rules: 1 severed finger, and a legacy that would outlive them all. The year was 1968. The month was July. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly down 7th Avenue, his cane tapping against the concrete, knowing his heart was failing and his doctors had given him 6 months at most. He was 62 years old. He had ruled Harlem for 3 decades. And tonight, walking toward Wells' Supper Club for what would prove to be one of his final dinners, he found himself thinking about a night 12 years earlier. A stolen guitar, a severed finger, a young white man who had understood justice better than most. Elvis was still alive, still famous, filming a comeback special that would remind America why he mattered. Marcus Turner was still alive too, working as a janitor in Baltimore, married to a woman who never asked about his missing finger, drinking himself unconscious every June 23rd. The finger itself still sat in Bumpy's study in its original jar on a shelf between a photograph of Mamie and a worn copy of Langston Hughes. More than a trophy, a symbol of the principle he had spent his life defending. Actions have consequences. In 12 years since the Elvis incident, not a single artist had been robbed in Harlem, not one. The booking agents knew it. The performers knew it. They came in greater numbers than ever, drawn by the music and the knowledge that they would be safe. 3 words: artists don't get touched, a simple rule that had transformed Harlem into a sanctuary. 12 days later, Bumpy Johnson died at his usual table in Wells's Supper Club, his heart finally giving out over dinner with friends. The Apollo Theater dimmed its lights for 3 nights. Men wept on street corners, and in Memphis, 2 weeks after the funeral, Elvis received a package. Inside was the glass jar with the finger and a note from Mamie Johnson. "My husband asked that this be returned to you after his passing. He said you would understand." Elvis kept it, placed it on a hidden shelf in Graceland, where it remained until his own death in 1977. The inventory clerks noted it as medical specimen, origin unknown. They never knew the story. Marcus Turner outlived them both. He died in 1999, age 72, still hiding his right hand, still flinching when Elvis songs played on the radio. His obituary was 3 sentences long, but the story lived on, told by old men to young ones. modified with each telling until truth and legend became impossible to separate. 3 fools robbed Elvis Presley. Bumpy Johnson found them. One lost a finger. The finger was delivered in a jar. And the lesson that mattered more than all the details was simpler still. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, artists were sacred. Artists were protected. Artists didn't get touched. Some rules never die. Some consequences echo forever.